Hello there everybody, welcome back to my channel. How are you doing today, beautiful? My name is Joesephyr, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at Force weapons, what they are, what Shinryu Difficulty is, all of that stuff, as it's something that's rapidly approaching the global version of Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia. And I'm pleased to tell you that I have been working on my next future pulls video for a good few weeks, maybe even a month at this point, so I wanted to share with you guys my Future Pulls Prelude video, which will explain all the mechanics of all the things that we're going to discuss in that video when it comes out in the near future. So if that's all stuff that you guys are interested in, then as always, stay tuned and keep on watching. Now before we get started, of course, don't forget to check out all of my social media links online, including Twitter, Twitch, Discord, and Patreon. On Twitch, you can see that I stream 5 days a week, sometimes more than that, and I spend a lot of time on there. So if you want to talk to me about any of the stuff that you see in this video, or any other video for that matter, then definitely come and check me out over on that. I'm going to give big shout outs to all of the resources that I use for Dissidia Opera Omnia, particularly today, and in the Future Pulls video when I release that as well, such as Dissidia Info, Dissidia DB, DissidiaCompendium.com, Remself, and some of the fabulous stuff that he's made in the past as well, Reddit, Leobov, Midiu. I've looked after thread after thread after thread of stuff when it comes to the JP version of the game over the last 9 months, so there's a lot of information to take in, so there's so many thanks to give out to all of those guys, and the Tonbury Troop as well. Thank you, because without you guys I wouldn't be able to make the research that I do, so that all of my viewers don't have to. So massive thank you goes out to you. And as well as that, I also have a lot of thanks to give out to my patrons as well over on Patreon, which is my members only website, where we do lots of different extra things, such as private voice chats, private streams, title cards I make for all of my patrons that go at the end of all of my videos, and of course I shout out one of my patrons every time I release a new video, which today is going to go to Multiracial Lion, who was one of my first patrons and one of my first Ultima patrons as well, and has actually aided me a lot in some of my research for JP as well, so a massive thank you goes out to you in particular. So we're going to try and break this down into what a force weapon is, what the force gauge is, how you make your force weapon the best it can be, how you can budget for force weapons, and what Shinryu difficulty is and how it incorporates force weapons. So let's start with the obvious question. What is a force weapon? So a force weapon is a brand new style of weapon that we expect to come out in the global version of Dissidia around late July, early August time with Kane's BT, and he'll be the first character to receive a force or FR weapon. So in terms of statistics, it's stronger than an EX plus 3 out of 3, but not quite as strong as a BT plus. It is, in terms of its gacha rates, it will have the same rates as an LD, so 1 in 200 on a ticket chance, and therefore, you know, pulling for tickets on them isn't the worst thing. The only difference in terms of the gacha itself is that instead of the pity rate being for 300 tokens, so 75,000 gems, it instead is 400 tokens, so 100,000 gems, so between LD and BT. And it requires a different resource entirely than regular Power Stones in order to maximize its capabilities. But we'll get to that in a minute. What a force weapon does is provide you with an additional attack for that character that actually synergizes with another character from a different Final Fantasy title, so that they and you will often find there's some connection between them, like using Kane as an example. He pairs up with Aranea because they're both Dragoons, and that's kind of a cute thing. Or later down the line, we'll see Tidus pair up with Theodore, Camnanort with Cypher. You know, there's loads of different characters that pair well, Renoa and Yuna, all that have quite fun connections, and you do an attack that contains both of them. And once you do that, you then set off a multiplier for damage for the next 10 turns, and as time progresses, other effects are added onto these as well, that you can then trigger a certain condition depending on the FR used to increase the total HP damage that all of your characters do within that 10-turn time frame. So what you'll tend to do is build up the gauge in order to use that attack, and then you will try and do as many actions as you can that fulfill those conditions, so that your damage multiplier goes through the roof, making the fight much more streamlined, and you'll be able to clear it, because as time progresses, the HP pools of the enemies that will be fighting in, say, Shinryu difficulty will be so high that you will eventually be required to use one of these weapons. Now that's not to say that you have to have every FR weapon as they come out. In fact, the opposite is quite true. Because of the ways in which that you build up a force weapon, it's very important to kind of pick and choose your favourites and the ones that you plan to use most frequently, which hopefully I will cover in the future pulls video when we hit it, so that people can really hone in on what makes a character special, why a character is used more frequently than others, because realistically you are not going to be able to max out every character's FR weapon even if you were to get them. So I wouldn't worry too much about getting them. Certainly off the bat, the first few weeks of FR aren't fantastic in terms of the FR abilities, so you don't have to get the FR weapons for them, but there are characters that don't have FR weapons that will synergize very well with those that do. A good example of this would be Core and Gladiolus. Gladiolus doesn't have an FR weapon even to this day in JP, but Core does, and it happens to work very well with Gladio despite not having one. So you'll find that the way in which the game is played is a little different, because a lot more of the customizability of the game is going to come from your team composition and your team building abilities rather than the way that you play in the moment. So what is the Force Gauge exactly? So the Force Gauge is a new UI component that accompanies FR weapons as the method in which you use force abilities. So you can't just use a force ability outside of a burst phase where it's literally just an attack until you have maxed out the force gauge. So the force gauge is increased through general play. Any action you take is going to increase it. There are certain things that will charge up the force gauge quicker than others. You'll notice that a lot of characters that have instant turn effects that don't actually deal damage, such as Selphie, Hope, Renoa, etc., Aerith, will have an easier time filling the gauge than characters that are primarily used to attack, but all actions will eventually fill that gauge up. And after you've hit 80% of that gauge, you'll notice that extensions on force abilities that allow your other abilities to deal more damage will also kick in. But it's only when you hit 100% of the gauge that you're actually able to use the force ability attack. And once you do that, you then have your 10 turns of force time, which is the duration in which HP damage bonus can be applied when the conditions of that particular character's FR are met. Then after that, it will then revert back to 0. Now, if you've awakened your force weapon to a certain extent, you'll be able to use your force ability twice. But typically when you're using a force weapon with a particular character, you would only use that one character's force ability. So you'll typically start to build teams around a particular force ability and use them in multiple sessions. So to demonstrate exactly what a force attack looks like, I'm going to use two examples here, both of which are very, very hot topics amongst the Dissidia community in Camnonaut and Tidus, because they are particularly noteworthy examples of very powerful FR abilities. Now, Camnonaut's Demon Blade attack has Cypher as his companion, can only obviously be used when you filled out the FR gauge completely, is a 3-hit AoE group Brave HP attack that deals split HP damage, but has a very large Brave damage cap increase on it that is also enhanced by limit breaking the FR weapon itself. And I will say that because it extends the amount of time in which you get the force time for, if you're going to use an FR weapon, you will want to max it out, and you probably won't want to go half-assed with any of that kind of thing. Just like any weapon we've ever dealt with before, really. But what this then sets up is the force time. So we'll go with the 10 turns as if it's been maxed out completely. And what this means is whenever a party member attacks any enemy that is afflicted with a debuff that means they can't act, so paralysis, etc., your HP damage bonus will go up by a certain amount. And then also when you use an ice attack, it will do a similar thing. Now, Camnonaut is a particularly weird example because it was considered a bug that this also counted any attacks that worked during a launch. And then this was kind of retconned by Square to say, oh no, that's intentional and that's a purposeful thing, when realistically it adds up to a heck of a lot of damage very, very quickly, because you're looking at 80% additional HP damage bonus and damage cap bonus on every attack that you're doing for those 10 turns. And then by awakening the FR weapon, you'll notice that you get more of that increase for each incremental limit break you do on the weapon. And then similarly, we'll use another example here, which will be Tidus. Now, Tidus's attack summons Theodore and is a 6-hit Brave HP attack 4 times with an instant turn rate, so it keeps in time with what Tidus does. And then that then sets up a different FR effect, which is going to scale off of attacking a debuffed target or using an instant turn ability rate, or yes, instant turn rate ability. So that's going to be more geared towards Tidus doing lots of damage. Whereas Counternautes, you'll notice that things like Kurasame LD Call are going to be extremely powerful and sought after to go alongside Counternaut, because it then fulfills his deal ice damage condition for increasing his FR gauge, his force time gauge. And then similarly, you might consider Snow, because he is an ice enchanter. Though Snow's actually not fantastic for Shinryu era. He's fine, he does do a lot of work, but there are other ways in which you can do ice enchant, because Counternaut, even after his rework, doesn't enchant the party by himself. So there's lots of little bits and pieces you can do to build your team up to fulfill a certain criteria. Sabin is another good example, because his damage multiplier increase comes from dealing wind and holy damage, which you could then use Fujin LD Call, or Fujin herself, and Ash or Kuja, anything that enchanted for holy and wind, which makes it a bit more stringent, but then you still get the ability to make the team around the characters that you really love. So how do I make my force weapon the best that it can be? So realistically, this is the bit where people are probably going to wince when they hear about how this is done, because it is quite a lot more intense than anything we've needed to do before. And I'm going to use this wonderful infographic that's made by Rem over at DecidiaDB.com, and I have been throughout the video, because I think it just showcases all the information that I want to put out perfectly. So a massive thank you for putting that out there. So force weapons are limit broken with power stones-ish, because they require high power stones to MLB. So they can be limit broken up to 3 times and then leveled, but then it takes 20 power stones of the normal kind that we know of to make a single high power stone, which means that it's going to cost a total of 240 power stones to max limit break an FR weapon, which sounds absolutely terrifying. But as time progresses, just like any new mechanic in any gacha game ever, they are something of a luxury to begin with, and the means to acquire them at their best potential gets easier as time progresses, such as when the Spiritus versions of the summons are released, like Brothers and Pandemonium. More high power stones become available then. There's ways of acquiring a lot more power stones, so for example, switching 100 gacha G tokens for power stones gets you 4 instead of 1, so you can get them that way. They are included more in events. It's scary to begin with, and a lot of this stuff is going to sound a bit scary to begin with, but it does get easier over time, and you're not expected to max out every FR that you pull. And I think that that's something that's very important to kind of let everybody know. When you do MLB an FR weapon, however, you do get additional bits that are added to the FR weapon, such as an extra use of the ability, so you can use it a second time, the full 10 turns of force time. All of that stuff adds up to, realistically, if you're going to use a character's FR, you are going to want to use it regularly to make up for the fact that you're spending quite so much doing it. You do also get force stones for max limit breaking an FR weapon, which is part of another system that comes into this. You can see why I'm making this video now before I go into future pulls. So what that is used for is the force enhancement boards. So similar to crystal levels, boards for EX Plus or LD boards, all that kind of thing. Very similar thing, and it's going to cost enhancement points, much like LD boards and character boards have always done. Costs a lot of them though, a lot. So in order for you to just max out the force board, you're going to need 15,000 enhancement points. And the bit, again, that people are going to wince at is that sounds a lot, because it is, and Moogle Mog Pass is going to play into this somewhat. So we get 5,000 points currently from any event that we do as free to play, whereas anyone who has any kind of Mog Pass gets 10,000 points instead of 5. So veteran players like myself who've had Mog Pass for a long period of time do have a lot of enhancement points saved up, but standard Moogle Pass should have its enhancement points increased to 15,000, premium Moogle points Poogle Pass's enhancement points should be increased to 30,000, but free-to-play players will stay the same at 5,000. Now, this sounds awful and terrifying, but none of the stuff that comes from enhancement boards is completely backbreaking. You absolutely have to have them on every character. What they do is they increase the Force Gauge charge speed during your turn, HP damage bonus, which you get from having it 80%, your Brave and HP damage limit for your skills once you hit 80% or higher, and then more HP damage boost during Force time. It does matter, but you will find that people will use their enhancement points and the Force stones that you get from both beating Shinryu difficulty missions and, as I said earlier, ML being an FR weapon, to then awaken to the point where they feel comfortable. Some players, like myself, will probably max out a couple of early ones just to feel comfortable doing it, though it won't be Kane, let me tell you that much. And you'll probably find that you won't have to go that far. A lot of JP players only increase their FR enhancement board level to level 22 or level 23, because then you're at least getting the maximum charge from all of your FR abilities, or all of your regular abilities to charge the FR gauge. And the Force Awakening boards isn't limited to characters that have FR weapons. This is given to any character that is featured on a banner that contains an FR weapon. So it's a little bit more quick on the uptake than, say, C90 upgrades have been. And you'll find that characters that only have LD weapons will benefit from these massively. Gladio, again, being a fantastic example. Selfie being a fantastic example. Garnet being an incredible example that JP didn't even have to the extent that we have her. So we actually have a bit of an ace in the hole with having global exclusivity with certain things. And there's every chance that more of that stuff could come out between now and that period of time, so who knows how that's going to go. So then let's talk about Shinryu Difficulty, which is the difficulty power creep increase that's meant to match up with FR weapons to make it so that they're worth pulling for. So this is level 300 difficulty, so it's a big increase. And you'll notice, as in the UI shots that I showed before, we are not the only people that get the FR gauge show up on the UI. The enemy also gets it. Now this is slightly different from Lufenia, because Lufenia, the orb ticked down so that we had to fulfill a condition for the Lufenia orb, whereas with the enemy Force Gauge, you'll find that the enemies have different effects depending on which enemy you're fighting that increase incrementally by 20, 40, 60, 80%, 100% of the FR gauge that they have, so that, or the Force Gauge that they have, so that different conditions will be met, such as their stats will go higher, they have an aura that makes your party slower, they'll interrupt your turns more frequently, all sorts of different things that trigger in that way. And they also benefit from Force time. So when they get to 100%, you'll find they'll do a particularly nasty attack that most of the time can actually be dodged by a lot of characters. So if you enjoy dodge tanks and things like that, you'll find them especially useful here. And their Force time exemplifies more of the same. They will get multiple effects that are negative to the party. They'll make sure that it's going to make it harder for you, and going forward there'll be even more different effects that come from those. So the idea is that you need to meet your Force Gauge before they meet theirs, or if you can't do that for whatever reason, perhaps the mission is designed so that their Force Gauge will get hit at some point during the fight, you need to be able to weather whatever comes out of that particular Force time from the enemies. So Braska's Final Aeon is an early boss with that's very likely to hit its FR gauge like completely full, and you'll have to deal with that and the turns that come after it so that you can then build up and counterattack with your own one. So it's a little bit more free-reined than Lufenia difficulty is, because you're not required necessarily to take certain characters in, like a particular new character in all the time. You're just going to need to deal with a lot of different mechanics. So using Braska's Final Aeon as an example, he renders any non-fire damage sort of weaker by having his Force Gauge fill up, which is supposed to encourage you to take Braska with you as a fire attacking character. But there's lots of options available to you to fulfill that kind of thing, whether it's Lulu or Ignis, or some parties just ignore the mechanic entirely. There's lots of little things that you can do for Shinryu, and as I said, you will find that the team building is going to be where it's at for the Shinryu era. So the last point of this video, as the prelude to my future pulls video for FR era, is going to ask, how does one budget for force weapons? So I think the first and foremost thing that I'm going to say is probably not something a lot of people are going to want to hear, which is, while you can probably collect all of the FRs through whether you're happy to spend money on the game still, or whether you just happen to get really lucky, there's a good chance you won't be able to make the most use out of all of them, because the resource cost to go into them outside of the gacha resources is much higher than any that we've had before. High power stones are very expensive, certainly early on, and you might not find that you need FRs early on, but use a friend unit one, like Kamlanaut has been touted as an extremely powerful character, but you can get by with friend Kamlanauts very easily just because of the nature of how he works. Now, FRs were actually complained about for a long period of time within the JP community due to the fact that they all equate to very similar things, which is namely damage multiplication. And this is largely true, as you'll see in the Future Pulls video. There are a few characters that you'll simply get sick of because you'll see them so regularly in clears of Shinryu fights, and the homogenization of the effects of FRs were majorly off-putting to a lot of players, to the point where the developers had to release a statement to say that they were changing things. So, at the very least, the early part of this era does concern me a little bit because of the combination of that and obviously the intensive resource spend that you'd need to do for the enhancement points and the power stones. People might feel like they're being nudged in the direction of Mog Pass, and obviously I don't know when the gem cap thing is being resolved or anything, but that's still in the back of people's minds as well. But the feedback was at least noted, and then like back at Christmas time, which was only a couple of months after FR started happening, so they added a much wider array of effects to the FR abilities to stop them all from feeling the same, with good examples of that being like Aerith or Faris or Balthea. And I do think that by not focusing so heavily on the spreading wide collection aspect like Lufenia encourages us to do, because obviously there are specific orbs that require specific things, Shinryu shifts like the focus back into team building, so onto the party that you are making. So you are encouraged to run the same character repeatedly. You can expect to see a lot of Kain, and that has nothing to do with his FR, but you can still expect to see a lot of him. You can expect to see a lot of Luna Freya when she comes around. Kamlanaut, Tidus, Tifa, Renoa. You will see a lot of characters very frequently because of the higher investment cost of FR weapons and the fact that you can use that same character's attack for many events. There's reason behind the complaints that people had at the time. However, if you shift your own focus away from that and focus more on which characters can I pair with this particular FR ability that I really love and I want to use, that's going to make it a lot more enjoyable for you. So for example, I'm really excited for Minwoo, who is way down the line, and he's not a character you absolutely have to have, but there's a lot of really cool interactions that you can have with him as a enemy off-turn damage dealer. There are some players that absolutely swear by Reno FR because it enables a lot of enemy turn-off damage dealing, whereas I looked at Reno and wasn't so fussed about it. Core was an example I used earlier for having a really good combination with Gladio. You don't actually have to have Core's FR to do really well with Core because his rework is already very good. There's generic kind of easy to use FRs that work really well, like Ursula or Iroha or Lude. They all work very well just by being there, and you can kind of just make them work. So there's lots of room for innovation on your playstyle between FRs, certainly after a couple of months of going into it. And I will use an example here of how little you actually need to pull in terms of resources if you don't want to, because Multiracial Lion very graciously let me use screenshots of his JP account and some of the FR weapons that he had, and he'd collected quite a few of them, but he'd only maxed out 9 of them. There's 7 pictured there, and he told me to mention that Vayne and Kain had also had theirs maxed out, and there were some that he didn't really want to use necessarily, but obviously Kain being the first one for JP, a lot of players didn't know that his FR wasn't going to be great, and it still was worth having because you had his full kit. So you can see that given that this is current in JP, well, current as of the filming of this video, you don't have to have that many if you don't want to. And if you want to spread yourself a bit thinner, then you could do that too, but you do run the risk of running low on resources outside of gacha resources, because Power Stones, you can only get as many as you had. And veteran players like myself who have hundreds of Power Stones now will probably run dry with them if they're not careful, but at least we know that we're going to be getting more of them more frequently as time progresses. And then with the terms of enhancement points, because there's so many of the characters that get them quickly, it's entirely up to you which ones you pick and choose doing them for. Certainly if it's a character that you haven't like maxed out the other boards for, because it all draws from the same pool, particularly if you're not into buying Mog Pass or Premium Mog Pass to get those extra points. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia is a free-to-play gacha title. Going completely free-to-play for the majority of gacha games is not meant to be easy. Therefore, we've kind of been spoiled a little bit by Dissidia, by how easy it has been to accumulate resources. I speak as somebody who has been free-to-play and somebody who spent a lot of money on the game as well. We've been very largely spoiled, so I think that in order for the game to make money, they do kind of have to nudge you in the direction of this will make your life easier if you want it, but they're not going to force you to do it. Therefore, if you're not wanting to spend money on the game, which is a totally understandable thing, I would suggest just go for the favourites, or the ones, perhaps if you're not worried about favourites and you want to go for ones that you know are going to be powerful, do stay tuned for the Future Pools sort of video that I'm going to be making that will guide you through what my plans are, and maybe that will give you some inclination into the kind of things you might want for yourself. In failing that, if you don't want to listen to the sorts of things that I do, there's lots of content creators out there that will have done loads of runs on JP with lots of different characters. So really, the thing to remember here is whatever you want to do in FR era, you can largely make it work even if you haven't got everything maxed out. But don't think that maxing everything out is going to be easy when it costs resources that you may not have. So that's everything I have to say about the FR era as a whole, and kind of hopefully guiding those of you that didn't really know what Force weapons were, what the Force Gauge was, what Shinryu was, how to make them good, and therefore how to budget for them correctly. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of an overview on what sorts of things there are. Now I do want to reiterate that I do not play the JP version myself, and I've tried to play the JP version numerous times and it's not for me. So if there is any discrepancy in the things that I've said, then fair enough, and I will be very transparent about that as well. But I do like to think that I've done enough research to be able to give a informed opinion on what I want to do in the future, but what you want to do in the future may not necessarily align with that, and that's totally okay too. So let me know in the comments below whether you're looking forward to the actual Future Pools video, which I will direct people to this one if they have questions about the FR era in general, and let me know what character you're most looking forward to getting their Force weapon, getting their full kits, because LDs and BTs are still important too, yo. Which Shinryus you're most looking forward to, who you're planning on using lots. Sound off in the comments below and let me know what you think of all of that. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and click that bell for notifications on any future videos I might be making. And that's going to be it from me, so a massive thank you to you beautiful for coming along with me today, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.